Okay, what's the lineup? J moves. Then the TBC. J. Okay. Thank you.
Vietnam's.
Hey, hi everyone, welcome to the semi-finals of the Pre-UADC 2017. I'll be your chair, Subra. Paneling with me are Miriam, Deepan, TJ, and Viha. On government, we have NUS ALS. And on opposition, we have Pats Moobs. Without further ado, I'll call upon the Prime Minister to begin.
Wonder Woman is a great feminist icon. Gal Gadot is not, and they're two different people. You could have had anyone else playing that role. Like even if you wanted a muscular woman who fights her enemies with like vigor and enthusiasm or whatever you want to have it, there are many other feminist icons who could have played that role. Charlize Theron when she played Imperator Furiosa in Mad Max Fury Road. Jennifer Lawrence when she played Katniss Everdeen. There are many other people who could have played this role, but instead they had to choose one who supported oppression of innocent Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Not a good idea. Who is Gal Gadot? She's a former model, an IDF volunteer, IDF officer, not a conscript, who plays Wonder Woman in the movie, and she has unapologetic Zionist views. Now, before just generalize what these Zionist views are, right? I think the particular brand of view that we are talking about is one that is unapologetic about calling for strikes on Palestinian territory, calling for an expansion of Israeli settlements into Gaza, calling for continued blockade of Palestinian citizens within. I'll take in a bit. So of all blockade of Palestinian citizens. So that's a very specific brand of ideology that we're talking about, not your standard person who's patriotic about the state of Israel. That's fairly fine. Yeah.
The only statement she has made is to say during the Gaza bombings, she supports her idea of fellow brothers and sisters, and she's up against the Hamas terrorists and cowards who hide behind civilians. Can you actually debate factual stuff?
No, because most of the Instagram, most of the Instagram posts, if you have watched them, clearly depict an unapologetic support for such a movement. Look, okay, you know what? I don't mind listening to your factual analysis later on in the LO, and we'll see who's right. Okay. Jesus. All right. Who is Wonder Woman? She's a DC comic book superhero and an Amazonian who fights for the oppressed and for peace. And that's fairly explicit because Sherman informs me that there are huge monologues in the comic book strips where Wonder Woman explicitly talks about why it is important that we don't sink to the level of man and indulge in violence in order to achieve our ends. Point taken. No, thank you. So the two main issues I want to talk about, firstly, are how people become blind to the struggles of Palestinian women, and secondly, how you turn Muslim women or Middle Eastern women and men off your brand of feminism. No, thank you. The problem is that many people equate Gal Gadot with Wonder Woman in the same way we equate Hermione Granger with Emma Watson, right? It's a standout role. She was relatively unknown before that, and especially for young women, it is fairly impressionable that they equate the fictional character and imbibe the qualities of the fictional character and associate it with the actual human being. So there's a halo effect pretty well documented psychological effect. And given the fact that the celebration of Gal Gadot and Wonder Woman means that the media downplays the severity of Gal Gadot's political views, the effect is that while some people will be equally ignorant of what the political views are and about the suffering of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, the people who do know and who find out about them tend to excuse the behavior of Gal Gadot as well as the views that she holds because of the association with Wonder Woman and a positive feminist figure. Furthermore, we think that as we celebrate Gal Gadot because of her role as Wonder Woman more, as a feminist icon, we think that it empowers her to be much more persuasive about the stances that she holds regarding the issue, even among undecided Israeli people, right, who may not hitherto have expressed support or displeasure at what the IDF is doing in the Gaza Strip. And this means there will be far less political outrage against Palestinian oppressors. So it is worth noting that, it is worth noting that given the fact that we have other feminist icons as well, and that we have had other feminist icons to play Wonder Woman, we think that the marginal benefit that you get out of having Gal Gadot as a feminist icon is clearly not worth the sacrifices that we're talking about in this place. No, thank you. Furthermore, it's not merely about Gal Gadot taking on Wonder Woman's persona, right? It's also about the reverse effect. Wonder Woman taking on Gal Gadot's persona. I got to admit, the one thing that Charlize Theron and Jennifer Lawrence don't have with Gal Gadot is that neither of them are soldiers. So neither of them exude the, I don't know how else to describe it, no thank you, the macho-ness or whatever that uniquely perhaps suits Gal Gadot to Wonder Woman's role in a marginal sense. The problem is that in the same way that you associate one with the other, you also associate Gal Gadot's political beliefs, for the army and the country that she fights for, with the positive values of Wonder Woman as well. Which means that not only are you at best excusing her behavior and turning a blind eye to such behavior, you might actually feel more positively about the particular political stances that she holds as well. No, thank you. So in the foreseeable future, what happens is that we think there will be far fewer media outlets, countries, voters, campaigners, and NGOs that will call out the particular stance as a result of the fact that they excuse this particular political stance. And even if you don't buy that particular impact, given the fact that Israel itself wages a media campaign in order to justify the actions that it's taking in Gaza Strip, you cannot deny that if Israel itself deems the media to be an important battleground, then we must deem the media to be an important battleground as well. The second thing I want to talk about is how you turn conservative Muslim women or Middle Eastern women and men off your brand of femininity. So let's talk about inclusive feminism. You want to be able to accept feminism on all stripes up to a point, right? Especially conservative Muslim women, because we want them to be able to access their own rights, political and economic, the right to be able to have your own jobs freely, speak your own opinions, so on and so forth. They do to varying degrees in different countries. So the idea is that there's a continuing movement across the entire continent, from France to Algeria, all the way to the UAE and so on. And comic books, superheroes, films, and actresses are one indirect and powerful way to influence the behavior and the opinions of such a large group of women, because it is the most convenient and in many cases the only means of access to Western modes of thought and Western culture. Because you don't have access to foreigners, you'll be other forms of expressing thoughts about feminism may be circumscribed in Middle Eastern countries where NGOs find it much harder to operate in the political space. So culture is one of the primary means by which we reach out to these individuals. Unfortunately, the problem with Gal Gadot is that she turns a lot of people off for obvious reasons, right? And I suppose I'll engage with it even if here at this point. Even if she's not actually someone who supports the current iteration of Israeli settlement policy, she will be perceived as such by a considerable group of women in society across many different countries. And at the point in which she's being celebrated by the Western media, and she's the iconic female superhero at this point, it would be very hard for Muslim women to ignore her presence. And as a result, they are more likely to be turned off by any attempts to insert feminist themes into other forms of Western culture, other movies that we show in these countries, interviews with actresses, so on and so forth. And given the fact that one of the primary targets of feminism is not merely Western women, but also Muslim women from across the spectrum, we think it is very important to target this particular vulnerable group of people in our society, and we don't think Gal Gadot is the sort of person that can allow us to achieve those aims. For that reason, I urge you to vote down.
The reason why I had to ask Mubarak, like, where is this Wonder Woman from, like, apparently it's the Miss Kira, is that I'm a Marvel fan. But if that's one thing that I learned about comic books in general, is that there's insufficient representation of women all across the entertainment business, particularly in comic books and also pertaining about pop culture. And we think that an avenue, for example, for you to take away and for women to feel that they can be empowered in other ways, for example, other than being pretty, other than, for example, using their sexuality in order to champion herself, and particularly in this aspect of showing that she's the leader of a tribe and also being able to combat and show her strength is one that we particularly cannot lose out. Even if we take them at the best case that this person is a dubious character, we still think that ultimately her achievements when it comes to shedding positive imagery, for example, of women all across the world is one that we champion. So I have two questions in my substantive. Firstly, what does a feminist icon entail, and why, despite this and taking them at best case, she's still one that should be regarded as a feminist icon? But secondly, on why female in the entertainment business is particularly important to celebrate, and we think a world where you can't let them get away with the fact that they say, oh, you know, we can reveal Wonder Woman and not reveal Gal Gadot, when they themselves in their analysis tell me that people often intertwine these two and you can't get rid of one and without actually celebrating another. But before that, several clarifications. So Adil said that she has supported Zionist expansionism, she has supported, for example, like torture and violation of human rights. Is that true? She supports specifically IDF, and it all comes from this Facebook post, which I'm sure you have seen of, you know, the one where she cuddles her child. It shows, and it's explicitly stated in the status, it's in Hebrew, but after you translate it, with Google Translate, unless Google is wrong, that we defend our brothers and sisters of IDF against Hamas extremism. Like, what does that show? This means that there are two implications of it. Firstly, that she is a product of conscription, that ultimately, you know, Israeli women, they're all conscripted, and therefore, even if, for example, that she supports this, we think it's a product of indoctrination. But secondly, what does this specifically entail? We think you shouldn't let government get away by saying that they support, for example, merciless killing of people. She explicitly says and voices out what are the aspects of Hamas terrorism that she specifically criticized. Two ideas. Number one, the usage of human shields, and secondly, the launching of rockets into civilian populated areas. This means that after all, she is still pro-human, and after that, in current, for example, the tour when it comes to interviews, people have explicitly asked her, what is your stance? At worst, she is ambiguous and she doesn't give an answer. But at best, she has explicitly go out there and say that, you know, what I've said might have been controversial, but ultimately I think that women across all borders should also be protected. We think that it's that specific statement that shows that despite, for example, her affiliation and something about her background that she cannot disengage, but she's still willing to go out there and defend women, even if it's from an ethnicity that directly oppresses or she thinks oppresses her own. So we think that itself shows the characteristics of what Gal Gadot is as a woman and why we think she's a bigger person other than what they want. So the stance coming from opposition is simple. We think that the world will be a better world. Our world will be better when we celebrate Gal Gadot. Government must defend a world where, for example, people don't support Gal Gadot. And understanding that 60% of movie sales, for example, when it comes to Wonder Woman, are specifically from a female audience, they have to also support a world where women are generally disinterested in watching that movie. Wonder Woman becomes a flop. It joins the ranks of Catwoman and are able, for example, to reach the mass outgroup of people that it can inspire. We think that's a reasonable stance for government to defend. But also, literally, they say literally, this is a misogynist statement. Any other woman could have played that role. What? That ignores the fact that Gal Gadot as a person endured a lot of auditions and actually have to fight powerhouses which are more established than her, Charlize Theron, Angelina Jolie, Jennifer Lawrence in winning that role. It also shows a commitment where she's able, for example, to juggle between her pregnancy and filming for 18 months to actually achieve that goal. We think that those are all celebrating ideas that shows to you that even, for example, when a woman is pregnant, she's able to do things that people don't think that she can do. All this idea of you being, for example, of pregnancy be a burden, pregnancy, for example, be something that bounds you or prevents you from achieving greatness is something that Gal Gadot actively challenges, and we think that is something that you want. But lastly, they say, look, we now skew the conversation away from Zionism, we completely forgot about that. Like, that assumes that once, for example, Gal Gadot is like a feminist icon, people ignore all the shady things about her, people are unable to delineate and have this discussion. We think that in status quo, where, for example, she is now considered a feminist icon, people are still talking about her involvement and are actively having discourse about that, for example, Zionist movement. This shows to you that there's no such thing that you are able, for example, to discuss about the fact that the Zionist movement is still happening, and also actively, for example, now that she has a greater icon or greater role to defend, to force her to actually engage in meaningful discussions about that. We think ultimately that's something that you have. Because ultimately, like even for example, the winner of the best director for The Pianist, Roman Polanski, he was involved, for example, in a few things about pedophilia. People are still able to give him the award and ultimately question him on what necessarily was that. So we think people are able ultimately to differentiate between entertainment and all this thing. But lastly, this idea about Muslim women and why we need, like, we can't expect that Hollywood must allow every role to be a brown woman and expect them to be able to defend everyone. We think that those alternatives already exist. Marvel's Captain Marvel now is Kamala Khan. She's a Muslim and she's able, for example, to reach out to certain audiences. We think that there's no such singular character that can reach out and be inclusive of everyone. We support the idea that there are certain, for example, feminism is a spectrum and they're able to reach out to different audiences depending on the characteristics that they are. So we think government is particularly tone deaf in this. I'm sure, go.
So even if we accept this further, that we cannot replace Gal Gadot with anyone else, don't you think if we didn't celebrate her as a feminist icon because of her role in Wonder Woman, that's when we were better able to divorce the persona of Wonder Woman from her as an individual?
No, you must also talk, like literally that ignores the fact that I tell you why Gal Gadot specifically has all her achievements and necessarily all her like ability to juggle that role and also like her role as a woman when it comes to, for example, challenging narratives that are already set. So like, yeah, sure, unless you can provide me an alternative, you should never, then we don't see how that flies. But like, what does a feminist icon entail? We think it's simple. The minute you set up female empowerment to different audiences and you inspire and you show that women have strength when it comes to different ideas or personalities, we think that is a win. So ultimately, what does government want? Government wants to set a threshold that says that you know there are a lot of standards that you must have, for example, for being feminist. That's literally counter-feminism in the sense that you're setting standards and this incentivizes a lot of women from entering and identifying themselves as feminists. Under their idea, Nicki Minaj cannot be a feminist because necessarily she speaks out against, for example, the white supremacy that we have in the entertainment business. So ultimately, we think that a singular standard of what it means to be a feminist icon is one that we necessarily cannot engage with. But also, literally, how does it engage, for example, feminism, especially when it comes to entertainment business? We think that in a world where there's a hyper-masculinity and when the CEO of Marvel himself has actually spoken out that we don't want merchandisers of Black Widow because necessarily they won't sell, we think it's extremely important to be able to penetrate as many aspects of the entertainment business as always. So we think that besides having Kamala Khan, a female top, we think a Wonder Woman and a celebration of Gal Gadot as that whole is one that we are able to use, for example, her artistic persona and also her artistic profile in order to reach out to a massive audience. We think that in a world where Jessica Chastain actively said that people are, for example, still relegating actresses to nothing but emotional beasts, we think a world where we celebrate an actress for challenging the narrative and labeling herself as a female, but at the same time a person that can juggle her personality with her online, her movie persona is one that we necessarily must celebrate. Very powerful, of course. Let me begin. All right.
When you put on the braces of Themyscira, when you claim to fight for justice, when you hold public office, we don't give you a gold medal just for passing the audition and playing a role. We hold you to a higher standard than that, a higher standard that fights for justice, not just for the white woman, but the poor woman in a hijab who deserves no less. I'm going to talk about a few things in my speech. All rebuttals are interwoven. One, what's our burden and are the benefits substitutable? Number two, who's this Gal Gadot really and what is she like? Number three, why would this hope never be balanced on their side of the house? And number four, how do we desensitize feminism? First argument, the burdens of this debate. Right, Dave said there's so little representation of women in comics, we should just celebrate Gal Gadot. Our burden from the very start, given that Gal Gadot was a nobody before she took this role, is that we think that the mantle should be passed to a less problematic woman with less background. Like the American girl who completed Ninja Warrior, she's fucking badass. They're okay with that kind of women coming to power. Here's the thing, any woman like Jennifer Lawrence who wanted to audition for Wonder Woman would have also passed the very same grueling trials and committed to the very same duties that Gal Gadot would have. So it's not unique that Gal Gadot is the only one who can circumvent all these things. So we do think our burden, therefore, is very clearly get another woman who can do roughly the same things as the script dictates, and she'll be a better representative because of who she is. Right. Secondly, Gal Gadot. Who is Gal? What are acceptable standards for feminist icon? And over here, we don't want to get into a factual battle, but there's a proper noun in the motion. It says Gal Gadot, so we have to discuss it. Now, they allege that the only proof of her supporting the idea of Zionist history is one Instagram post. Unfortunately, her Instagram history, her Facebook history, her CV, the fact that she's part of a volunteer corps who extended her conscription and who have been deployed to the ground means that she's not any ordinary person who just got conscripted because she's Israeli. Even if this is all untrue, she doesn't support Zionist views, the fact that they admit she has an ambiguous statement but blanket support for the IDF means that her stance is not critical enough to look at the specific actions that IDF looks at. She adopts the lens of patriotism and glosses over a whole host of crimes. When she says that all women should be defended, talk is cheap. Tell that to the Palestinian woman who just lost her house because her beloved IDF is bulldozing her house. Publicity is hardly going to put food on the table. Furthermore, even if she's not Zionist, the fact that she's so popular makes it very easily for Israeli propaganda to co-opt her to the movement, as they already have done in Haaretz. She has become the new face for oppression with a smile on your face and a muscle in your bicep. That is the problem when you allow this cow personality to overshadow the kinds of heart they're taking over in the status quo. We will say by association, because of her history of what she's done before and the world today, she's problematic inherently and shouldn't have taken up the post of a defender of justice. Now, even if they argue further, on my third extension, that Gal will be moderated by stardom, that she'll have to change her views once she becomes Wonder Woman properly. Number one, that's after the fact. But number two, I will now show you my extension, how coverage will never be balanced in the status quo because of structural incentives. What are these? Bear in mind that the motion says a celebration as an icon. So this often backs the definition of what this celebration looks like. DC Studios, the people make it, I have every incentive to publicize her, splash her face up, put out lots of positive think pieces to celebrate her, Gal Gadot, and promote her as a star. Here's the problem. When you have DC Studios buying a lot of airtime, flooding social media feeds with how good she is, downplaying the criticisms, you are starving out that very critical mass which allows you to see that Gal Gadot has a checkered history and the problem. This is especially problematic given that she's taken on the mantle of Wonder Woman, a 70-plus-old-year comic book historian which traditionally aims to fight for justice. This means that because it's sacred to attack Wonder, it's not considered kosher to attack Wonder Woman, it becomes very hard for you to criticize Gal Gadot because she's intertwined with rich history of Wonder Woman. Especially because when Gal Gadot becomes a breakout star, financially, movie studios, casters have every incentive to prop her up and create a cult of personality. The same way that Emma Watson, got her own because people just kept plugging positive coverage of her to raise her asking rate so that future movies she stars in will also make money. This is how we structuralize ignorance at the point where the movie industry has every incentive to make sure she's popular and above reproach. The example of Polanski precisely proves a point because Roman Polanski is still getting that award. There's a problem with the status quo and why this cause will never be balanced. Fourth extension, that's how we desensitize feminism and what is particularly important in the round. Bear in mind, we want to talk about impacts. So who's impacted? When you talk about how Wonder Woman is watched by young children, young women all around the world who look up to her as an icon of positive behavior, the trouble is that when you intertwine the cult of Gal Gadot's views with that of Wonder Woman, the actress then becomes the figure. I just talked about how Emma Watson and Hermione were basically one and the same after about the first two movies. This is critical because when the cult of the Cursed Child, the new play in Broadway, cast a black Hermione, there was a lot of outrage because Hermione is supposed to be white, Hermione is supposed to be privileged, but people couldn't distinguish that the character Hermione wasn't intended to be white in the first place. We didn't know. So at the point where you intertwine Gal Gadot's values with that of Diana of Themyscira, when people say, I want to be Gal, I want to be like her, at best, they're inured to a problematic views and they don't look at it. At worst, when they find out about it, they start to excuse it. Oops.
How many people recently in American politics have been following the liberal values of their beloved celebrities in the US?
Quite a lot actually, because it's your privilege that fails to understand that a lot of people do follow cult icons like this. Furthermore, if Gal Gadot was so influential as a whole, then all Patrick's benefits of how she can change the scope of feminism also don't hold. You can't have it both ways, Mubarak. Go and resolve that. So at the point where blind media worship doesn't encourage critical feminism, when we hold up icons because they're popular and excuse everything else, Child icons get a free pass because of their history. What should feminism aim to do? We don't believe in a feminism that settles for anything less. We want feminism to aspire to be better. And the point where feminist icons like Nicki Minaj, yes, they can be problematic. Yes, no one is perfect. But feminism as a whole should never vilify icons in the same way that Wonder Woman is currently being vilified. They should be actively questioned and called out on their problematic beliefs. Like Taylor Swift may be a feminist icon for some, she can be a horrible bitch for other people. The point is, let's have a discussion. Let's have people realize that not everyone is perfect. But the way Gal Gadot is being portrayed by the media, propped up by studios, means that at this point, she is irreparable beyond reproach. And this is the sad tragedy. That in order for them to take low-hanging substitutable fruits, like how strong she is, how kick-ass she is, we ignore the sufferings of people who have been hurt by the things that she stands for and some have even participated in. This is not a debate about a privileged white girl. This is about the debate about a young hijabi like you in the audience who's seated and hopes to find wonder in Wonder Woman. You are the one who turns the tears to ash and the wonder to despair.
Yeah.
I think proposition was grossly uncharitable in this debate. Because note, a lot of their case surrounds this one particular premise that seeks to say that there's no ability for us to challenge the cult of personality of Gal Gadot. I'm going to make this claim, and I think it's pretty reasonable, that icons are not infallible, are not unquestionable, and we cannot, it's as if we can't challenge their positions. An icon doesn't crowd out any ability for us to piece through discourse in acknowledging this sort of oppression that is currently impacting the people in Palestine, right? I think it's a really simplistic debate on proposition to say that because we can have any other individual and because this person made a particular statement, that it crowds out any ability for us to ever recognize the discourse for Israel and Palestine. And I think that is regrettable. Secondly, I am also ashamed to hear this analysis that perhaps the individual who has worked really hard, who has gone through the same audition, because they say, let's have someone else, but she did compete with other people, right? She was the best individual to fill that position. But the argument that, you know what, there needs to be an accurate standard and an accurate representation of what it means to be a feminist icon is antithetical to being a feminist to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. The concept of feminism is the ability to acknowledge and participate in discourse without having standards of political correctness and bullshit being the determinant of whether or not your discourse is valuable to begin with. And that's why I think proposition is largely out of this way. The first thing I'm going to address is her character, right? And I'm going to address this really simplistic assertion that was made on that side of the house, is that being in the IDF is a prima facie bad thing because they committed oppression. The first thing I want to say here is that the program of conscription into your country belies the choices of individuals whether or not they want to participate. But secondly, even if she didn't choose, right, I think the capacity to want to defend your country is a choice that we should allow for an individual to participate in, because the presumption seems to exist on proposition that only Palestinians are dying. Given that she says that Hamas is hiding behind civilians and bombing Israel citizens, I think that's a legitimate position for her to take. But thirdly, sometimes individuals also join the IDF because they want to alleviate the pain of suffering. So these are your intelligence officers being able to make the denomination that perhaps, you know what, we shouldn't bomb this particular area because there's a large group of civilians in that area and we need to make calculated decisions, ladies and gentlemen. But lastly, if being in the IDF is a prima facie bad thing, we point to the example of members of IDF being the pioneer and the creators of the combatants for peace that seek to put down violence as a means to deal with the Israel-Palestine conflict. Secondly, we will forget about Israel-Palestine. I think the first thing I want to say here is that it's ludicrous to say that just because we celebrate Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, we're going to forget about Israel-Palestine. The fact that everyone in Malaysia goes batshit crazy every time an element of Zionism comes out points to the fact that people are still consciously aware about this particular conflict. The fact that the individuals recognize that in every instance there is a bombing between these two countries, that we still talk about what sort of discourse can we engage upon. I don't think just because we don't celebrate her, we're going to find a magical solution to a two-state plan, right? But thirdly, on this idea that Israel is going to co-opt you, I think that Israel is going to co-opt Gal Gadot. either way, right? In any capacity that she's in. But are people able to piece through the discourse? I think they can. And I think that in a world where proposition seems to assume that people are going to be overwhelmed by the costume of Gal Gadot and aren't unable to piece through her as an individual and the manifestation of her talent to this character, I think that world is problematic. Fourthly, I think when it comes to conservative women, and I think that basing the entirety of your case on conservative women is very problematic and indicative of the fact that they don't have enough material to rely on this debate. But secondly, that there's going to be some elements of feminism that's going to turn off conservative women to begin with, because it's a presumption that is a Western standard. That's why conservative women in the states that they were talking about were able to co-opt culture into feminism and created cultural feminism that's localized to their individual countries. But even if they're turned off, right, I think, are there no other individuals that women in these areas can look to? I say they can. Individuals like Malala Yousafzai, individuals like Hadina Bagri, individuals like Mona El-Tahawi being able to talk about the politics of discourse and feminism and being a champion of women in that particular area. So I don't think having Gal Gadot being celebrated means that we remove any ability for them to be able to recognize feminism. Lastly on discourse,
So, what then is the marginal value of having Gal Gadot as an additional feminist icon versus the harms that we bring? What then is the marginal harm that having Gal Gadot as a feminist icon, given that there are other feminist icons you can celebrate, going to be compared to the harms?
Okay, the first thing I want to say here is that the ability for us to acknowledge that being able to identify with a particular ethnicity doesn't mean a prima facie rejection from the rest of the world for you to be able to believe in the ideology to begin with. I think we live in a liberal world that seeks to say any conservative position or any position that we think is antithetical to our liberal bubble and overzealous political correctness means that a person should never be valued for a contribution. And I think that once we recognize that there's an ability for us to piece through whether or not this individual really is like a horrible individual to begin with, whether or not the manifestation of her talent can be separated from specific ideologies that may necessarily impact individuals. But I think the harm that you are talking about is also marginal at best, right? So you're saying that an individual will never be able to relate to the Israel-Palestinian conflict, that a person will never be able to understand feminism, that a person will never be able to divorce these two individuals. But I just give you multiple analysis to indicate why this is not true to begin with. And I think at best, we should allow for the celebration of this individual, because we think that beyond anything else, her as an individual and her effort and her ability to like win this role is something that needs to be celebrated in a world where women are sparsely celebrated. Lastly on discourse, I think the world proposition is really odd, because the presumption is discourse is exclusive in nature. It's as if social issues cannot be discussed on a like side by side on a comparative, because they will crowd each other out. So the presumption is you can only talk about feminism here, but you can't talk about feminism anymore because there's a Zionist element to that particular discussion. I think discussions can overlap all the time, and I think the allowance of discussions to overlap means that we seek to acknowledge the intersectionality in issues that exist in status quo, and acknowledging that perhaps the issue is far beyond just race and religion, but also indicative of inclusion of feminism as well. I think at a point where you create standards of feminism for people to be able to engage upon, you're going to turn people away from the feminist discussion to say that A, in order for you to be a valuable contributor, you must fit into the mold that we place upon you, but B, that the Zionist discussion far outweighs and overwhelms the feminist discussion that exists in status quo. I don't think that's true. I regret and I hate the world where Palestinians are being oppressed and being killed, and I can relate to that. But I think a feminist discussion and empowerment discussion must exist as well. And at a point where this individual won this role, should be celebrated for this role, and can manifest that role without her coming forward and saying, I am Wonder Woman, but also at the same time, let's kill all Palestinians, which has never done in status quo, is something that can be divorced, ladies and gentlemen. And I think that's really important. In a world where individuals can still be challenged for their narratives, positions, and discourse, I think proposition lost its way.
Yeah.
The comparative in this debate is not a world without Wonder Woman if we do not celebrate Gal Gadot. The comparative in this debate is the ability to revere the icon of Wonder Woman as a person who stands as a feminist against things like war, tyranny, and violence without having to associate it from now until decades later with the image of Gal Gadot and her holding a baby supporting the IDF. So I think at the end of the day, what we need to recognize is that they needed to show us why is it that specifically celebrating this particular individual that was poorly chosen for the movie and therefore desecrating the ability for millions of women of all different kinds of races, ethnicities, and religions to celebrate this one particular icon that's able to unite individuals is somehow something that they are willing to accept. Let's talk a bit about what the media works, how the media works. I think a large part of the DPM speech was about how we're able to talk back and fight back against what Gal Gadot really talks about. Like really, like if you look at the way the media works, people with more power, the bigger media institutions always dominate the airwaves. Like they define what truth looks like and they tell you what exactly you ought to believe in a world in which, and let's understand that the audiences are different. So I mean, maybe Malaysia, like in the circles that people hang out in debating circles, all think that Gal Gadot is problematic and don't espouse society views, recognize that the large part of the kind of feminism that actually venerates her are those in the Western world. And guess who actually is the one who's supporting Israel? Guess who's the one actually giving money to Israel as a whole? It is the people in the West. So if you don't convince these people, and if a conservative society speaks out against feminism and Zionism, they are still silenced in a world in which you continue to allow for white feminism to perpetuate this particular notion of what exactly a feminist icon looks like. So I don't think that this is actually something. I don't think that the criticism of Zionism the criticism of Zionism when it comes to the discussion of Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman really actually has the kind of impact that you are talking about. But more importantly, let's analyze the audience in this case. Who are the people who are specifically excited to see Wonder Woman? Oftentimes these individuals, they are probably very into pop culture, not really maybe that much in the political discourse. They're oftentimes from the minority of individuals in most settings. But also, we're talking about young women who see Wonder Woman on posters and go to the movies with their parents telling them this is great, this is something that we've been waiting like decades for. At the end of the day, these are individuals who are unlikely to be able to distinguish Gal Gadot as an individual and her different political views more than that, with the fact that she's seen to be the face of peace and justice for society. So I think at the end of the day, if you want to argue that people are able to go into this nuanced discussion, then you also have to tell us why exactly people like Taylor Swift refuse to give any sort of political commentary when it came to the United States elections, because we need to recognize that you can't divorce a star from their political views. People will look at what they see and people will not question them. Look at how, despite the moray of feminist critiques of Taylor Swift, people still, the kind of personality still allows her to be shielded from that kind of criticism. People are stars and these people have influence in society, precisely what you want to talk about. So you can't argue that they somehow have no value whatsoever, they can't influence individuals. I think you need to recognize that stars are bigger than life for the most part. Then they told us, and I love this, right? They're like, look, she only stands for the idea that Hamas does some things wrong and somehow that's problematic. Now, if you think about it, right, even if we accept what they had to say and she only supports the IDF, what's the IDF guilty of? She is saying that the IDF's carpet bombing of Palestinian soldiers, continued torture and kidnapping of these individuals, that somehow this, and the way that she paints it, is that this is justified because it is in defense of Israel. So if she doesn't, as long as she continues to tell you that what the IDF does is somehow justified, you continue to legitimize the same kinds of violence that exists in the world today. You can't run away from this. We don't think that people are, as she is, as nuanced as you tell us that she is. Now, what exactly they tell us about feminism? We told you a couple of systemic issues in which we are able to talk about, in which we are able to explain why exactly we are able to deal with this. But before that, let's present two scenarios. I think there are two ways to deal with this issue. When you want to talk about criticism, either one, you completely ignore the issue and try to silence the fact that she actually supports the IDF, in which case you silence the oppression that these millions of Palestinians face, and you ignore the fact that one of your biggest cultural icons right now is someone who actually supports this particular fight and actually fights and is a voluntary person within the army to be able to fight back against them. So if you want to argue that she's simply someone who is nationalistic, this nationalism comes at the expense of millions of lives. But also, I think Adil gave you analysis about how the battle between Israel and Palestine. This is a media battle. It is one in which Israel continually either tries to silence the fact that they've been oppressing Palestinians, but also tries to paint it as a self-defense issue. Gal Gadot is the epitome of this particular presentation. We don't think we ought to skew the media anymore in favor of a genocidal oppressor. Next thing that we wanted to talk about. Here's the second thing is that you listen to what she actually has to say, and then you realize you cannot escape from the fact that she actually supports this particular idea. Now, next thing that we want to talk about, how exactly do we change the problem? They say we hung our head only on conservative women. We don't think so. To a large extent, we argue that this affects women across the board, especially women who don't have fully formed political opinions, or women who are like young and impressionable and see like everything the star says or like the celebrity says as being true and not. So this also affects the Western feminists across the board. But we talk about conservative feminism. They told us that you can still look at people like Malala Yousafzai, for example, and how many things in like feminism, for instance, are something that alienates other women. Here's how I want to deal with this idea of standards of feminism. There is a range in which some things are acceptable, like Taylor Swift maybe like hiding the fact that Kanye West actually talked to her before that, and then there's genocide. Yeah.
If your premise is any act of support is going to harm another group of individuals, by that virtue, you're going to limit any ability for a Republican to participate in public discourse and be recognized as an icon.
No, I don't think that's the case. Again, right, let's look back at like the intensity of it, because you can't muddle it up and be like, oh, but you can't show actual standards. I think that when the standards violate international human rights, it's a pretty good standard that we ought to be able to say about why you don't celebrate a particular individual. But more than that, when we talked about the media, we said that conservative women are turned off from this, and it's not just about every other kind of feminism, because we're able to talk about how sexuality is something that's unique to the Western cause, but the idea of the Israel-Palestine conflict is something that is unique to the heart of many individuals, especially conservative Muslims that live in that area, and that's when you turn them off from the idea of feminism. That's when you tell them that feminism is bad. They're much more likely to choose their tribal instincts. But lastly, I think they had no rebuttal whatsoever about how oftentimes this debate also goes beyond just the idea of Gal Gadot as an individual. The fact of the matter is that when Hollywood continually props up and supports individuals who have problematic, incredibly problematic political motivations, what happens is that you continue to give them a structural incentive to allow these individuals to continue taking up roles. You don't provide any disincentives. That's why you're able to normalize the fact that we ought not hold our celebrities to a higher standard than we do right now, which means that individuals who watch these movies are going to be inundated with more critiques or more problematic views than they otherwise would. The disincentive is good because it means that an entire generation of individuals are going to grow up with positive role models, even if they don't realize they were happy to propose.
Maybe sometimes we are all very, very pro-Palestinian, but sometimes we need to look beyond our bubbles and look at what people think and feel. When Gal Gadot says Hamas are cowards for hiding behind civilians, she shows concern for civilians who are at stake of their lives, like whose lives are at stake. When she says, my brothers and sisters, I support you at IDF, she shows concern for comrades she has fought with. And she shows concern for the safety and security of the people she fought with, but also when she goes up against and says Hamas are terrorists, she's expressing hatred for an organization that has caused massive chaos and caused lives of not just fellow Israeli citizens, but also Palestinian citizens in the region. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, we must understand the perspectives that people come from. And maybe they're not always that bad. A couple of things in this debate. One, is she evil? Second, even if she is, why must we still support her? Note that side opposition is the only side in this debate who even attempted to debate with the converse. No, thank you. That even if she isn't evil, we would still win this debate. Note that if we can prove, or if you have a doubt that she is not evil, there is absolutely zero case on side government to say why we still shouldn't regret that particular, we shouldn't regret the feminist icon. Okay, so is she evil? One, it says she's evil because she's not conscript. Assuming this is true, we already responded with no further response from them, which is that a lot of times people genuinely join IDF in order to alleviate suffering rather than contribute to it, right? So if you're part of the military, for example, you, can do things such as argue against bombings in areas where there are a lot of civilians. Those are reforms that people do from the inside. They're just like people join politics to reform from the inside as well. I don't think it's that ludicrous an idea. But secondly, right? The second thing was her support again. Her support for the military is they just said she has an Instagram history of Zionism. We literally quoted the quotes that she had and defended every aspect of that quote, and they never really came back to it, right? She said, "Well, I support my brothers and sisters. What's wrong with that, right? I support Hamas are cowards for fighting." Is that at no point did she say, "Yeah, I support the killing of innocent civilians within the particular aspect." But the third thing that I would say here, and most importantly, I think, is that why is this the case for Wonder Woman, right? So for Gal Gadot, where why can't we say, for example, Vietnam soldiers? We can recognize the US military did a lot of really shitty things in Vietnam, led to the My Lai massacre, for example. But when a military veteran says, "I support my fellow soldiers in Vietnam," we never say, "Hey, that's an evil act." Because support of your military and your comrades was never an act or never saying that necessarily meant I support the death of civilians in Vietnam, for example, right? And I think that's the highest standard that you can't hold Gal Gadot to. That's very problematic. No, thank you. But let's assume she is not evil. Sorry, let's assume she is evil. Why would she still celebrate her as a feminist icon? One, because of the impact she had as Wonder Woman, challenging of stereotypes, and it's not just marginal, but a benefit to all. Because the challenging of stereotypes means freedom for every woman who's restricted to gender roles. What was their response? That's not our burden. Wait a minute. So now this side comes up and says, look at the motion. Not only are they saying we regret her celebration as a feminist icon, but we're going back to history and changing events. And then we wish she had not done all the good, amazing sacrificial things she had done, and then we regret that she became a feminist icon. So what is the supposed to say? Yeah, in a world where she didn't do any of the great things that you, any of the great things she did, we would still celebrate her as a feminist icon? What the hell? This debate has to be, cannot be decoupled from her activities. If she has made sacrifices, you can only regret the fact that those sacrifices made her a feminist icon. We are perfectly correct in being able to argue that those sacrifices justify her being a feminist icon, right? So that trade-off needed to happen. But the second thing is but the thing is, right, even if you don't buy any of that, we would still win this debate on a couple of fronts. So they said, guys, we'll still win this debate. Why? Because first, on a principle front, they never really came back to us. They said these women should be held to a higher standard. But why? Why is it that female feminist icons have to be set to a higher standard than others? Leonardo DiCaprio's scandal with 1MDB never makes him not a male icon anymore. But hey, if you want to be a feminist icon, you must be able to live up to massive standards of that. Sherman's response was, hey, but it's the extent, genocide. Wait a minute. War crimes. Wait a minute. Hey, by that logic, no Republican can be because they support Abu Ghraib. What the hell, right? Number two, seriously, no Republican can be a feminist icon because she supports Abu Ghraib. But number two, when the hell, and this is a concession, by the way, she says it's an extent. So she's okay with feminist icons with problematic views being feminist icons as long as it's not too much. And her standard was genocide is the place where we draw the line. At which point in time did Gal Gadot come out and explicitly say, I support genocide or I support any kinds of war crimes? I think on a principle level, they've already lost this debate. But even if you don't buy that, we will still win on outcomes. Before I move on, sure.
Right. So you can rationalize Gal Gadot's views and tell us about all the reasons why it might potentially be okay for her to say these things. But for individuals who see the Israel-Palestine conflict as a two-party war in which they must support one, they don't see it that way.
Great, they don't see it that way. Let's assume she's evil. They don't see it that way. What happens? They said, guys, you'll be able to control discourse because DC controls the media. And the way it happens is like you fund positive think pieces that like stops any kinds of dissent from coming in. I call bullshit for a couple of reasons. One, ask Hillary Clinton, who wanted the Washington Post to have a lot of think pieces. I'm sorry, but discourse has been decentralized in the modern era by a large extent. People are able to question those views, and the vast majority of discourse about these things happens on social media where it is decentralized. But number two, that also ignores the fact that within these liberal circles, pro-Israel sentiment is actually quite unpopular. It is untrue that like we're going to start living in this world where like people are going to be like, yeah, Gal Gadot's true, and like Palestinians are false all the time. In effect, if anything, all of kinds of Hollywood followers are people who follow are living in a liberal bubble as well. These are people where pro-Israel sentiment is actually quite problematic to have, right? Because it's very easy. Because it's very easy to be called a genocidal maniac. I think in this world, it's actually anti-Israel sentiment is actually more popular. So I don't think it's true that's going to happen. Let's say, but like she's an icon, so she's being beyond reproach. All of Hollywood said Hillary Clinton. Nobody gave a shit. Icons are not beyond reproach by people, and people question icons all the time. The fact that she's controversial is actually what leads to more discourse and more discussion. And I think that's what leads to more awareness if that's what you're after. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, like she doesn't need to be the greatest of them all, but we can appreciate the positive impacts she has on feminism. Real close.
Hello, I'm a flaming liberal. I engage in vices and I like advocating for absolute rights. I'm also a Muslim. I advocate for the right to practice and I support against the act of oppression, right? So also sometimes in debate, I say things like, you know what, people should be able to believe the IDF and be a member of the IDF. Sometimes in debates, I also say things like, you know what, perhaps the world will be much better with communism because democracy is a peaceful system. But the thing is, just because I'm a walking contradiction in and out of debate and the way I represent myself, people still celebrate me as an individual, people still like me because I'm nice, but also at the same time, because they can divorce my ability to make particular decisions and a manifestation of my talents and my statements and my identity as an individual. That perhaps is an intersection between the two, and then we can't condemn an individual just because of one part of her identity. We're going to be talking about two things. The first is the best case of proposition, and the second is the worst case of proposition. Let's look at the best case. The best case of proposition is that we must employ a strict standard in order for us to be able to cultivate a perfect icon that we can glamorize, that we can use as a means to forward empowerment to better the world. I think the first thing is a lot of their analysis about perhaps as a better individual, perhaps she didn't deserve it, perhaps the inability for us to decouple her Facebook post and her ability to work really hard for her role is anti-feminist in nature. But secondly, when it comes to the entertainment industry, is that we will posit from opposition that a loss of one feminist icon because of one position that we don't agree with her is still a loss to the feminist cause. And that's why I told you in my speech that presumably when it comes to discussing social issues, that we can allow for two social issues to exist in discourse because one doesn't absolutely obliterate the other, ladies and gentlemen. But secondly, I think, and there was no response to this, that accounting for intersectionality when it comes to the identities of individuals, because the standard is you are morally reprehensible at the point where we can employ a standard where we don't agree with any tenet of your identity and your positions, ladies and gentlemen. This means that individuals like Amri Agastya can never talk about feminism because she's a socioeconomically privileged woman. And I think that this is a wrong position to take because we must allow for individuals to be able to manifest position irrespective of their identity. But thirdly, it doesn't account for There are people being able to make choices in life and accounting for the different environments in which the person is placed in their life and what that choices mean to the individual. So it's not just the expectation of gender roles and what you must be, but it's also the expectation of your ethnicity and what that means for an individual. And then we told you that the ability for you to feel a nationalistic support to your country without you going out and flaming, like calling out individuals to kill all Palestinians is a legitimate position for this individual to take, right? But even if that's the worst case, I think that people in this world are not dumb, you know, and it's not just like saying this because debaters are smart, but other parts of the world, we have rational, reasonable individuals who can piece through the discourse and look at a comparative analysis that are made by individuals who support and individuals who are not, and can decouple those facts. And I think you are able to get communities of individuals who can understand either they choose to support her or they don't, but we don't think we regret her position. Our case is she's evil, right? And we already told you from the start that we don't think she's an evil individual because she never advocated for the act of genocide. I think what she did in that post is a humanization of this war, as I indicated in my speech, because the presumption is we always assume the victims of this particular conflict are only Palestinians and no one else. The fact that there are individuals in Israel who are also harmed by Hamas, individuals she wanted to support, individuals that she says Hamas reject, and the civilians that are harmed are something that, you know, that is important to her. But secondly, can we criticize her? There was no response to this like infallibility of Gal Gadot to the point where it apparently overwhelms the discussion of Israel and Palestine. I swear to God, Gal Gadot is not this magical unicorn that we needed for the last 60 years in order for us to resolve the Israel-Palestinian conflict, right? I think that they're launching a proposition that we can view her as a feminist icon and then directly translate to everything and every action that she does as a celebration of her as a Zionist icon was never proven in this debate by proposition, and that was a burden they had to show.
I'm very much aware that sections of the internet, especially liberal bubbles, view Gal Gadot's politics in less than positive light. And I'm sure we will have constructive dialogue in certain portions of the internet. But I'm not concerned about those things. I'm not, perhaps in the ultimate grand scheme of things, even concerned with what Gal Gadot actually believes in. Because from the psychology of the average film goer who believes in celebrity worship, or who at the very best case scenario decides to put a halo effect on people, regardless of what other questionable stances he or she may hold, who do not have knowledge of nuance, whose only access to these issues is by watching Wonder Woman, who may very well be undecided Israelis or Muslim women everywhere, have very different reactions to Gal Gadot as a feminist icon. Some of them may be more inclined to excuse the stances or interpret the stances in a particular way. Some others, like Muslim women who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and who are naturally suspicious of her and the way she couches her support of the IDF, will inevitably be turned off by her when we celebrate her as a feminist icon. So not everyone is going to react the same way. I think that's fairly obvious. We're not that stupid. But many of them will, and that is indeed a problem. So let's characterize Gal Gadot. Like, she has explicitly defended Israel's actions as an act of self-defense. Now interpret this how you will, right? Even if I buy the idea that she doesn't actually believe in the sort of specific actions that Israel carries out in Gaza Strip, launching white phosphorus or that sort of thing. The reality is, after paying token lip service to the fact that Hamas terrorists are hiding behind the shields of women and civilians and children, she goes on to deliver a blanket defense of the IDF rather than attempting to criticize or be more critical of the stances of the IDF regarding this particular issue. Now you might say, for an ordinary citizen, you can't expect that much from a person. Correct. But Gal Gadot is not an ordinary citizen at this point. Gal Gadot is now a feminist icon, and she has to be held to considerably higher standards as a result. Some late material by Mubarak. We talk to us about standards and how Vietnam veterans were criticized after they came back from the war. Wrong, they were. Because there were many people who were conscientious objectors during the Vietnam War and was paid jail time in order to stand up for their beliefs. And this is particularly true of celebrities like Muhammad Ali. So if we're talking about standards with regard to how veterans should conduct themselves in the public sphere, I think we already have decent precedent there. If we're talking about burdens, can we celebrate another Wonder Woman? Like, I think we can celebrate a counterfactual in which Wonder Woman was played by someone else. If you don't buy that, celebrate a world in which you create a sequel where Wonder Woman is played by someone else. Even if we cannot celebrate a human Wonder Woman, the actress behind the Wonder Woman, we can at least celebrate the comic book character that has certainly outlasted the actual human figure by several decades. If you want to talk about decentralized discourse, like sure, Hillary Clinton may be vilified and criticized endlessly on social media, but she's also a politician, not an actress. She does not enjoy the halo effect that an ordinary actress who can benefit from celebrity worship will be able to enjoy. And also, like, if we're talking about liberal circles, maybe some circles are more critical of certain figures than others. But there may be, like outside of these liberal circles, far more diverse responses and perhaps far less critical ones as a result. Our mechanism was fairly simple. At best, at worst, an apology for that sort of behavior and excusing such political stances. And regardless of what she actually believes in, the reality is when the Israeli government or when the Israeli media use her as a tool to persuade undecided Israeli voters to continue supporting the IDF in this particular brand of defense policy, or to continue to persuade supporters worldwide through media campaigns to stop lobbying against Israeli actions in the Gaza Strip, that is when we see a real effect. Now, you just say if we didn't celebrate Gal Gadot as a feminist icon, would we be able to stop the Israeli-Palestinian war? Of course not, right? She's only one feminist icon. But every inch of ground that we have is an inch of ground that we ought to fight, right? For every perhaps one woman that Gal Gadot empowers by persuading them to become warriors, figuratively or literally, there are many more women who either are turned off by her brand of feminism and her political stances, or conversely, are far less, in Western countries, far less critical of her stances, and as a result, ignore the suffering of many other women. So, given the fact that that for this particular feminist icon, she harms more people than she actually helps, I think it is fairly obvious that she should not be a feminist icon.
Thank you. I can shake hands. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, so is it getting more substantial? No.